Welcome back. Why is it important to reflect and understand our history? On our show today, we'll sit down and speak to a community-oriented historian, Hassam Munir, who argues that Islamic history has not only had an impact in the world as we see it today, but also provides inspiration to revive our communities to effectively challenge the narratives that underpin Islamophobia. Hassam recently graduated from York University with a BA in Communication and Media Studies and History. He is also the author and founder of iHistory, a blog he started in 2014 to share his research with the broader community on Islamic history. He has also showcased his research at various public platforms, including Halal Food Festival, Muslim Fest, and Islamic History Month Canada. Let's talk to him now. Hassam, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to ask you probably a very blunt question to a community-oriented historian. Why should people care about history? Like, you know, someone who's out of school, working, say someone like me, I got the history lessons I needed to back in school. I read a few Islamic books here and there.
Right. I think the purpose of studying history and the benefit of doing so is all about broadening perspectives. And in my understanding of it, it starts not with the past itself, but with the present. So you look at where you are as a community in the present. For me, as a community-oriented historian in the Muslim community, what is our situation in the present, and where are we, vis-a-vis where we would like to be? So I look at all of the problems within the Muslim community, outside the Muslim community in the world today, and I try to look at all of the potential solutions, because I feel like as a Muslim, this is my responsibility to look beyond my own life, my immediate self, and try to create a better world for everyone. And when I look to that, there are experiences that I have to learn from, because Allah even says in the Quran, in response to a sort of challenge, a question that the Quraysh, in their enmity to the Prophet ﷺ, they had put this question to him, why hasn't an angel just come down and delivered the message, and he would have been angelic and we would have just believed him? And Allah responds to that in the Quran by saying that if the earth was populated with angels, I would have sent down an angel to deliver the message. So Allah is teaching us that a human had to be sent to deliver the message, because the receivers of that message are humans. So humans learn best from human experience. Now, the idea is to sort of contextualize the problems we face today and to look for potential solutions. What is our range of experiences that we can look into? We can look around us in our immediate society, within that society, right? We can look beyond that, all over the world, different cultures, what kind of solutions do they offer? But it's still a very limited perspective, especially now, because we live in a globalized world. So to some extent, there exists a monoculture in the world, where throughout the world, the McDonaldization, globalization, things are more or less becoming the same increasingly, right?
So is the idea of looking at history and saying, okay, we're faced right now with Islamophobia, there are leadership challenges in different parts of the world, is the idea to look at history and say, okay, this happened in history, therefore I don't want history to repeat itself? That's often a saying that we hear, right? Let's not history repeat itself. So when you say you want to look at the present and then reflect on the past for solutions, how are you reconciling that phrase that we often hear, that it's about history not repeating itself? That's kind of why we look at history.
The thing about history repeating itself is it's not, what's paramount, what's most important, I think, is to not sort of have this very deterministic view of history.
What do you mean by that?
By deterministic view is that everything is predetermined already, and there's nothing or little we can do to affect that or to change the direction and orientation of our societies, of our communities, right? The history repeats itself is more often, it's not just stated, I think it's used as an excuse, right? Well, what can I do if history just repeats itself? It's just human nature, et cetera, right? So to look into the past, the human past, and for Muslims specifically into Islamic history, I think it's, the idea there is to seek inspiration, again, like I said, for dealing with the challenges that we face today, right? And also to have it's an external reference point, right? They say, there's a saying that when you're within the mob, when you're within the community, you can't see the community. You need a bird's eye view. You need to take a step back and look at the broader picture to truly understand things. And to understand anything that exists in front of you today, part of that is knowing where it came from, how it came to be, how it developed, right? So you have to go back, I think, and use that external reference point. It's like, okay, it's a monoculture, it's a globalized world. Problems are very similar throughout the world, no matter which problem you're looking at, even Islamophobia, right, for example. Now, let's take a step back, let's go back into history and look at it from that perspective, and also look at how things were different in history, and how they created a different society, a different community.
Do you have an example for that? So we're living in a time, where there is a monoculture. Islamophobia is on the rise. We're dealing with a lot of discrimination these days, not just of Muslims, but also of a racialized, anyone who's of a different color, for lack of a better word, right? I'm trying to be diplomatic here in my language, but what are do you have one brief example where someone can try and understand the point that you're trying to make about you be in the present, but then you're learning from your past to inform what are some of the solutions that we can implement?
So I think, for example, the whole idea of racism, right? Racism as it exists throughout cultures around the world, but and it has connections with slavery historically, with systemic discrimination, systemic racism, but if you're looking at it purely from a perspective of the world around you today, you're limiting yourself, severely. If you step back and go back into history and sort of analyze how this idea developed, right? How these Darwinism, social Darwinism, for example, how it contributed to the idea of racism, how the Industrial Revolution contributed to our current understanding of racism, how different cultures have viewed racism throughout history, right? And Islamic cultures and non-Islamic cultures such as the ancient Persians and Hindus, etc. It really helps to break away from this idea. I mean, and the whole idea is to challenge yourself intellectually, to challenge the idea of racism in your own mind. Many people just assume that this is the way things are, right? And this is the way things always have been, but it's a very particular history of racism in the West that we're usually thinking of. And racism, though it has always existed to some extent in all societies, but it has taken many different forms, and there have been many different responses to it. So it's about looking at some of those root causes and sort of figuring out what responses were implemented back then, and how can we leverage from those and to inform sort of some of our challenges that we're facing today. Exactly, and a good example is, coming back to the concept of slavery, race was used as a basis for slavery, the transatlantic slave trade in the West, etc., right? But in a different context, right? So if you go to the classical Islamic period, there's a body of scholarship that exists that shows that, first of all, slavery, though it definitely did exist, it wasn't racialized, and secondly, slavery had a very different purpose, and the sort of legal justifications and legal limitations on slavery were actually designed to end the slave trade, right? To slowly get rid of that. So again, it's about having a broader vision, a broader perspective, and not just limiting yourself to the limited perspective that you would get if you were to just observe the world around you. Do you think this is how history is taught in this day and age, in schools, I don't know, in other settings, or do you think it needs to be changed? No, I think history, the way it's taught, is very much it's very much, we're still in that sort of nationalist mold of studying history. I'll give you an example from my personal experience. I grew up here in Canada. I went to school my entire life in Canada. I remember being very excited in grade 6, in the grade 6 history textbook, because there was one paragraph about Islam, just to give a background how the Christians had reconquered Spain from the Muslims as a background to Christopher Columbus coming to the West, and I was all kinds of excited about that, right? And then that was the only paragraph about Muslims. Just the only paragraph, right? And then you keep going and you keep expecting to learn more about the world, right? But you're into this pipeline of Canadian history, and even Canadian history, you're in a very only certain types of Canadians are represented in that history, right? And then I took grade 11 world history, finally expecting to learn world history. They thought the whole ancient period and stopped just before the Islamic period. Then I took grade 12 world history, and they started just after the Islamic period, so at the Renaissance. The Islamic period was just skipped over in that whole process, right? So I think there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. It's not, history is definitely taught in a very, I would say, non-objective way, right? Non-objective way, because there's a very nationalist focus, especially, right? We're only going to talk about Canadian history, and that's all that matters. And we're going to talk about particular people in Canadian history, and I think that contributes a lot to these ideas that history is boring, that history is irrelevant, right? So,
I think you've laid a very good foundation. We'll have you back on to talk more about this topic. So thank you so much, Hassam.
Thank you very much.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.